koutou katoa, he mihi mahana tēnei. It's so great to be with you today, although I'm not actually with you, which is depressing. I was really looking forward to seeing everybody down at the National Library today, but obviously the protests and COVID have rather interrupted that. Thank you particularly to Courtney for that very warm introduction. So I was very excited to come and talk to you today because I think that even though we do very different things, there is quite a lot of overlap in what we are trying to do and how we approach it. So I thought I would just talk a little bit about what we at Stuff are doing and what I am doing with my team in the Wellington Newsroom, and try to draw some parallels between your sector and our own sector. Because we are on Zoom or whatever technology this is, I thought that I would just speak for maybe 20 to 30 minutes. I think it would be pretty boring for everybody to listen to me deliver a long monologue, but I hope that that will leave a lot of time for questions and discussion in the second half. So I know Courtney has some questions prepared, but if you have some questions for me, I would be delighted to answer them. As Courtney said in the introduction, I returned home in 2020 after 20 years overseas working for foreign publications. And although I'd been home during that period, you know, it was 2 weeks at Christmas every second year. I wasn't working in New Zealand or really cognizant of the huge shift that has happened in New Zealand over that time. I'm certainly much more aware of it now, and what has happened. And I think one huge change for me, and very, very great change that I'm really happy about, is New Zealand's progress towards truly reflecting its bicultural roots and how much more inclusive our society has become over that period. And certainly the difference between when I left New Zealand at the end of 1999 and when I came back has been huge. And in fact, I was puzzled when I came home and to see like these Pākehā guys emailing me saying ngā mihi nui at the end. And I thought initially that it was virtue signalling. I did not realise just how entrenched this had become in New Zealand in a really, really beautiful way. So I think the use of te reo in everyday life is a huge improvement and change that's really noticeable. And the way we are trying to more fully encompass our bicultural roots and our increasingly multicultural society across the board, whether it's in media or museums or libraries or political representation, however it be. And I think this is a really generational change in New Zealand. And I know in my own newsroom, I don't need to tell younger reporters that they can use Māori interchangeably with English in their stories, that they can say whānau for any family, not just a Māori family, and that they can use tamariki and these common words without translation in their copy. This is really a native, a natural thing for them to do, and I think that's a really great change and one that I am certainly trying to encourage. As Courtney said in her introduction, at the end of 2020, Stuff, newly under New Zealand ownership, having been bought by Sinead Boucher in the middle of the pandemic, issued a really groundbreaking apology to Māori, in which we apologised unreservedly for 160 years of frankly racist coverage. This project was already underway when I joined Stuff in October that year, but it really reinforced for me my decision to leave the Washington Post and to come back to New Zealand and be part of what I hope is the rejuvenation of Stuff as a New Zealand media company that really cares about Aotearoa. So this apology involved a lot of exhaustive and exhausting reporting from our journalists, in which they went back and scrutinised 160 years of our coverage. And so from my team, I dispatched people to Whanganui, and they talked to Tariana Turia and people who people who were involved in our coverage of Motua Gardens at that time, and we sought to put the record right and to talk about some of our wrongs at that time. Um, but some of the other pieces of journalism around the country were frankly like just gobsmacking. Even today when I was going back through things to look for examples, I couldn't believe we'd actually done this. So one example is in 2011, just over 10 years ago, we had a headline that said, "Weak lawmakers loading guns for fearsome ferals." And they were Māori. That's how Māori people were described 10 years ago, fearsome ferals. That was on an opinion piece, but still we published this. And in 2007, the Dominion Post, the paper I now edit, had a story about Tameite and Tūhoe, in which the headline was "Gorillas in the Mist," gorillas as in Guer. Just shockingly bad coverage that is really horrific to me to this day that we published that so recently. But as part of this project, we wanted to own up to this and to say we did wrong, and very recently we've done wrong. And we said that we were putting a PO in the ground and saying from this point on, we vow to do better. And so as part of that, we did introduce this new company charter with Te Tiriti at its core, and we've really gone about increasing the diversity in our workforce so that we have more people from different backgrounds, that includes different ethnic backgrounds, as well as people with different abilities. We have several reporters in wheelchairs and with other physical challenges, as well as ethnic Chinese, ethnic diversity in our workforce, as well as Māori and Pacifica reporters who bring to the job their own perspectives. And I hope that that's really reflective in our coverage. I think it, well, obviously I'm biased, but I think it is reflected. And even this week when we've been covering the protests, we've had stories about what mana whenua think of this protest, and local iwi leaders talking about the need for these people to get off this land, and what an affront it is to mana whenua. And I'd like to think we would have always reported in that way, but I think we definitely are reporting in that way now that we do have making a concerted effort to think about bringing all perspectives to our reporting. I 100% agree with this approach and am driving this approach from within our newsroom. I think we as media, like libraries and museums and other public institutions, have a responsibility to be at the forefront of this kind of cultural change and help inject momentum into it, but also to help bring people along with us on that journey. And that's something that I think about a lot in my day job. To backtrack a little bit, at the beginning when I arrived, I thought we should not be translating common Māori words. And we still don't translate whānau and tamariki and things like this, but I thought people should know these words. And then I've kind of come to a realization, having got emails and things from elderly people and things saying, I don't understand these words, I don't know what tangata whenua is, and things like that are maybe a little bit shocking in this day and age. But I've kind of come to the realization that it's our duty to take people along on this journey and not to alienate them from our coverage. So when I think about the translation in our stories, we are now erring on the side of over-translating rather than under-translating, because I don't want anybody to feel left out of this. I want them to be able to learn these words through the coverage, and that we can all progress on this journey together. But again, as Courtney intimated, this is a very, very polarising approach, and after Tā mātou pono, our apology, and with our ongoing coverage, every day I get emails saying we're too woke, that people are cancelling their subscriptions because they think that we are beholden to the government. I think they see this as that being part and parcel of a government effort, which it's not. We were doing all of this ourselves anyway, and I think it's reflective of this broader cultural change that is happening in New Zealand. But It has coincided with the creation of the Public Interest Journalism Fund, where the government has allocated $55 million to shore up the media industry. They have done that because they recognise that having a free and vibrant press is a fundamental pillar of democracy, and that we were facing an existential crisis during the pandemic. So there is this money allocated to us, but very much at arm's length. It has no bearing on the kind of coverage we do every day, in the same way that it's at arm's length from TVNZ or Radio New Zealand. This is funding without any control or without any say whatsoever. But at the same time as being accused of being too woke, too progressive on these counts, there is, of course, also a sizable group of people who say we aren't doing enough, that these apologies and these pledges are hollow, and that, we haven't changed enough. To which I say, I think you're right. We are on a journey, but the point of this was to put this stake in the ground and to say this is a signal of our intent and what we want to do in the future. And we absolutely want to be held to account. And I mean, we will make mistakes inevitably, but we do want people to call us out for that. And I do think we will recognise that. We will apologise. We will pledge to do better. It's a journey that we are all on together. But I see this as a really positive development in our media in New Zealand. But the factors that I've just described here about the polarization, the people who say you're doing too much, you're doing too little, you're too woke, I get an equal number of emails saying we're too hard on the government, we're too easy on conservatives, we're too hard on conservatives, whatever. I think as long as I'm getting an equal number of complaints from every perspective, I think we must be doing an okay job with being fair and balanced. But I think the factors at play and the kind of cultural change I've described that I've noticed since coming home is also very much the kind of sentiment that is driving the protest down at Parliament right now. New Zealand and the world has been through a really rapid economic and social and cultural change over the past few decades, with the global financial crisis in 2008 and 9 that obviously ravaged many economies and changed our economies in fundamental ways at that time and left many people behind during that. When I look at the US, where my lens was focused over the past decade, the cultural change that has happened there, and that the US is now a majority-minority country where ethnic minorities make up the bulk of the population and are changing the electoral boundaries within the US. And that sense that blue-collar workers were being left behind in what propelled President Trump to his victory in 2016. We don't face all of those problems here, but we face some of them, and some little snippets of them, I think, are active here. The fact that economic inequality has worsened so much in New Zealand, and that was really striking to me coming home after 20 years to see the long lines at food banks during the pandemic, the number of homeless people on the streets, the really structural changes, many of which relate to housing and people's inability to secure housing, and the knock-on effects from that, whether it's in the workplace, whether it's education. I think that this is causing a lot of structural issues in our society. And naturally, as part of that, some people feel like they have been left behind. Some people have been left behind with this widening inequality in New Zealand. And so I think that has been definitely exacerbated by the pandemic, with the job losses that have come with that and the uneven nature of those, how particular groups of society have been more affected than others by that. And I think that is what is a big part of what is motivating some people to go down to the Parliament grounds at the moment and to protest. They feel like they have been left out and left behind. And so in my approach as an editor of the Wellington newspaper during this, it's been a real balancing act for me to think, how do we cover this? This is a huge news event. This is a size, it's a very small minority of the population, but it's still a sizable group of people down there with grievances that cause them to do this. So I've been looking at how we cover this in ways that do not spread misinformation and disinformation, but enable people to try to understand why 1,000 people would go down there and camp in Parliament grounds. So I think that is our duty as reporters at this point in time, to hopefully promote some understanding, because in everything I learned in the United States is that we can't just listen to people who agree with us. We can't just, fall into our little tribes and stick with that. We have to make an effort to understand people who are disaffected and why they are like that. So in our coverage over the past few weeks, we have tried to talk to as many protesters as possible to understand their motivations, and that in itself raises its own challenges, because of the fact that many of my journalists have been physically assaulted, verbally abused. It's not a very easy place to report down there at the moment, but we have been trying to contribute to the understanding of what would encourage people to go down there. And a big part of this is also we live in an era of misinformation, and this is something that is a big challenge for us in the media industry, clearly to deal with. Misinformation, disinformation spreads like wildfire through social media. We live in an era where fake news is the moniker thrown at everything that people don't agree with, where the former president of the United States talked about alternative facts as if there's such a thing. We have seen this play out most alarmingly in the United States, where President Trump called the press the enemy of the people, where 5 journalists were shot dead in their newsroom during this period. And I think we can't be complacent about this. We can't think that this kind of sentiment won't come to New Zealand. It is in New Zealand now, thankfully to a much lesser extent, but all of these protests that have marched through the streets of Wellington, people down at Parliament now talk about treason, they talk about arresting and worse journalists. Journalists have had tennis balls thrown at them, and it's just tennis balls, thankfully, but I can imagine a time when those tennis balls become rocks or worse. So I think we need to be really aware of the threats that journalists face down there, but that won't dissuade us from doing our jobs and trying to tell the real facts of what is on the ground there. The people who are down there at the protest, there are a lot of ordinary people, middle class, mainstream people who are unhappy with the way we are going. There are also a lot of people on the fringe, people who are conspiracy theorists, who won't listen to facts and won't be swayed by science. People who think the government is out to kill them and that we are complicit in that because we are writing stories about science, basically. The fact is, and the pandemic has shown us, that facts can literally be a matter of life and death. We saw in the United States when the president was talking about how this virus would soon be over, that masks weren't necessary, who promoted bleach as a remedy for the coronavirus, that people literally died in the United States as a result. So it is alarming to see the Trump signs down at this protest, and this hardcore of people who will not listen to science or will never believe the science or the facts, the kinds of things that we are trying to write through our journalism. And I really think that this is an existential question for all of us in your business and in my own. And I was struck by a quote that Maria Ressa said when she won the Nobel Prize for Peace Prize last year. And she said, without facts, you can't have truth. Without truth, you can't have trust. Without trust, we have no shared reality, no democracy, and it becomes impossible to deal with our world's existential problems: climate, coronavirus, and the battle for truth. And I think this is the challenge for us, the challenge for you. How do we promote trust at a time of such misinformation and such mistrust? I was listening very enviously to Courtney's statistics there about trust in museums, trust in libraries. Unfortunately, we do not in the media enjoy those same levels of trust. In fact, it's been declining really markedly over the years, and especially with the rise of this misinformation, fake news, slogans that are being thrown at us. So much so that last year the Edelman Trust Barometer, which is a global survey which also looks at New Zealand, showed that global trust in traditional media had declined to an all-time low. Now, we are used to being compared to used car salesmen and real estate agents, but I think we would definitely be below them now. The barometer for last year said that the global infodemic has driven trust in all news sources to record lows. 53% of people trusted traditional media, which was down 8% from the previous year. And amongst the people who were surveyed in that, 59% said that they believed journalists were purposely trying to mislead people by saying things they know are false. 59%. I mean, that's a really, really shocking number, and one that should come as a real warning to us. These same findings are echoed in the New Zealand section of these surveys, so that the trust in news in New Zealand fell between 2020 and 2021 by 5 points to 48%. So fewer than half of people say they trust us now. So this is a challenge for us. What can we do about this? Another change that's happened at Stuff since I arrived, and one which I think is a positive one, is that Stuff declared that we would make trust our metric, not clicks. And so we are trying to be guided by how trustworthy our stories are. That's obviously a very intangible thing, and one that is much harder to measure than clicks. But one that is really our kind of North Star now, and our guiding principle to see, how we can instill trust in our journalism. And we have done things like we now have an explainer editor whose job is to unravel lots of complicated subjects. He's done a lot of excellent reporting on the coronavirus, breaking down things like R numbers and sequencing and things that help people understand what is going on. And we've also published this series called The Whole Truth, which aims to debunk some of the theories out there, for example, whether it's okay to get a vaccine while you're pregnant, and things are answering some public health questions, and that I hope will help instill trust in what we are doing and contribute to Aotearoa's understanding of how our society is functioning. One particular thing that drives me crazy and I think is really damaging for trust is spelling mistakes. We have a lot of spelling mistakes and grammatical issues as part of the constriction in the media industry. Of course, our banks of sub-editors no longer exist. We do have some checks and balances, but not as many as we used to have before. So the thing that I am constantly banging on about to my own reporters is to check the spellings of everything, because if you cannot trust us to get the little things right, how can you trust us to get the big things right? So that is one thing that I am really, really hot on. And also being transparent, so that when we do make a spelling mistake, everything that we get wrong, I insist that we should correct. We should write into the story, even if it's one letter in somebody's surname, we should acknowledge that we made a mistake and fix it. So that is not always applied completely equally across the board, but I think something that will become more and more prevalent as we try to be accountable and to instill that trust in what we are doing. There is an outfit in the United States called the Trust Project, which is a journalism project working on this, that is trying to find ways to instill more trust in what we do. And some of their core principles are saying and being transparent about things like who funds the media organization and what its mission is and what are the standards and ethics guiding this company. And so that is why Stuff published a charter and that we do have our standards and ethics published online so people can read them, hold us to them where necessary. Another key pillar of promoting trust is to show who is creating this journalism. Who made this is one of the questions. So that is why now we include details about the journalists in stories. So if you go to Stuff right now, you will see the photo of the journalist. You will see a little bit of their biography so you can understand their background, their education. We say what languages they speak, if they speak languages other than English. And we include their email addresses so people feel that they can get in touch with that journalist if they want to. Another thing that we're doing to promote trust is to be more transparent about different kinds of journalism, to explain what is this. So that is why you will see more labeling on stories to say this is news, this is analysis, this is opinion, or increasingly this comes from an advertiser. This is sponsored content that somebody has paid for to help fund the organisation. And so I think it's really important that we are transparent with readers about what that content is. Another key thing that we think promotes trust in journalism is citations, naming sources. That's why increasingly you should be seeing hyperlinks in stories to the original source, to a primary document, not just to another story. I think enabling people to click straight through and to see where we got the information from and how we then relayed it to them is another key factor in instilling trust in what we do. And a particular factor that instills trust in journalism is a sense of connection to a community. If you know that somebody is part of that community, has deep roots, cares about that community, that will also be reflected in the reporting and hopefully lead to better reporting and more trustworthy reporting. So these are some of the strategies that we are embarking on at Stuff and in the Wellington Newsroom to try to increase trust in what we do. I know for myself, a big part of the reason why I came home was being a foreign correspondent all those years. I mean, it was such a great adventure. I went to so many crazy places and saw and reported on things that, it was frankly a privilege. It was the first draft of history to be in some of these places at those times. But I was very, very far away from my audience. At that period, it was a responsibility on me to make sure that I reflected what I was seeing clearly so that people, for the people who would never go to North Korea or Libya or wherever I was reporting from. But after 20 years away, I suddenly kind of craved proximity, and that was a big part of the reason why I chose to come home and to work at Stuff, and that I wanted to be part of a community and to be accountable to that community and a community that I really cared about, my community, and so that's why I wanted to come home and do my bit. I am accosted in the supermarket about headlines that we have, and that's absolutely what I want to happen, and to be accountable and hopefully be part of the rejuvenation of media in New Zealand, because I think we've seen very clearly from the United States what happens when the media stops working, when it becomes factionalized, when there are alternative facts being offered. It contributes to the breakdown of society, to distrust. I don't think it's hyperbolic to say it shakes democracy to its core. I think that is an element of what we're seeing in Ottawa and in Wellington at the moment, and that there are people who want to bring down a democratically elected government. So I think this really is an existential, serious matter for all of us to be facing. I've laid out here some of the things that we are trying to do to improve our journalism and to instill more trust in what we are doing. Maybe, I hope it will work. I hope it will definitely work for the vast majority of society. I don't know that it will work at the extremes, but what I do know is that we cannot stop trying, that we must every day go to work trying to do better, trying to be more balanced, trying to be fair, and doing our bit to contributing to making Aotearoa a better place. So that is what we will do. We will continue to try every day to make that difference. With that, I have gabbled on for far too long, so I will invite your questions, and if you would like to throw those at me, I'll do my very best to answer. So thank you very much for listening to that long speech. Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm now juggling my pad, the iPad, a pen, the lights. Thank God I've got pockets today, so I can put everything else in there. Thanks so much, Anna. Just looking at the Twitter stream, I could see how engaged people were and how many questions they had and comments, and I'm just waiting for them to come through on the magical iPad as well. Listening to you, one of the things we talk a lot about in museums and our sector is about diversifying the workforce and the new skills that people need to bring into jobs. What are you looking for in journalists today when you're recruiting?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think kind of a degree of curiosity and tenacity. I mean, nobody goes into journalism for the money, that's for sure. So I think, people who are really curious about the world and are not easily dissuaded, So I have lots of young journalists who are really raring to go, who are out there at the protests all the time at the moment. But it's a really hard job. There's a lot of criticism in what we do, some fair, some not. So I think, anybody who is curious and who can string a sentence together always helps as well, though we can also work on that.
I was really struck by your point around getting the little things right, typos, grammatical errors, mix-ups on image citations, all of those things. Fray the edges of trust. It's also definitely something in our organisations. I mean, God forbid you send out a staff email with a typo in it, but once you put that out in front of the public. But what I was really struck by was you talking about how one of the strategies for building trust is that community connection of journalists, reporters, news people who are bedded into communities. And I think that's something, certainly in museums and in our sector, that's been more and more important, is to almost to dial back our own voices and to dial up the voices of the people who we're representing. How it's almost like a partnership approach to journalism in a way. And I wondered how working in partnership sits with some of those other ethics around investigation and objectivity.
Yeah, it can be very challenging at times, and particularly if you are reporting on a particular community, you can go a long way to representing all of that community. And I think a big part of our coverage and the things that we discovered with the Tamato Pono project was that we had relentlessly focused on the negative and not told the positive, not told all of the good things that were happening at Waitangi, only showing the protests or the clashes and things like that. So part of what we need to do is show the full reflection of what's happening. But I do say to journalists, not all news is going to be easy. There are going to be some tough calls that you need to make and stories that will be difficult to report, but we need to be guided by the idea that we report fairly, we have balance, we report soberly, and give everybody the chance to put their side across. But it can be a real challenge at times. But I think overall, that community connection really becomes evident in a story. In the foreign correspondent world, we talk about parachute journalism, where people just come in, spend a few days on the ground, go away, and I guess sometimes the story's all right, but a lot of the time you can tell that they are not embedded in that community and they get things wrong or they misrepresent things. So I think having people out in that community, talking to people all the time, shows, maybe not in quotes, but in the tone and the texture of the coverage.
And I guess also the trust that you'll be accorded with information or with perspective or even with knowledge, that when that parachute accusation is something that hits our sector as well, and you see people, whether it's artists who approach a gallery and want access to a group of local kids to do a project for 3 days and then they go away again, those kind of temporary and almost slightly extractive relationships rather than two-way relationships.
Yeah. I think one thing that I've struggled with is the stories that we choose not to cover.
I was just going to ask you about this, so it's amazing. And I'll just break in and say, in preparation for this, I did do a lot of reading, and we all love citations. So later on today, I will tweet out a list of things that I read in preparation for this talk that possibly includes a link to something that you're going to talk about now. Maybe.
Oh,
yes,
okay.
What we don't
Did I
cover.
write it?
Yes,
Yes,
I
wrote. Good. I know what you're talking about then. There's lots of times when, and since I started in this job, where news tips have come to us, people have reported things to us, and maybe in the past we would have covered them. I'm thinking of one particular incident which involved a troubled young person doing something stupid. And it is definitely the kind of thing that will get lots of clicks because this young person did something stupid, but it came to us and I said, there is no public interest in this. I was able to have a background conversation with somebody involved who said, this rangatahi is getting support. We are wrapping all of this awhi around him. He's okay. There is no wider impact. And we chose not to write that story. And I think I hope that that's the kind of thing we'll be seeing more and more often, and to choose not to sensationalize, not to cover things, unless it is, like in that situation, there wasn't an institutional problem. There wasn't a structural problem that needed to be reported on and held to account. It was just one instance. And we choose not to.
It didn't bear the scrutiny of potentially hundreds of thousands of people.
Absolutely not. And the other way I face this on a daily basis is with letters to the editor. So letters to the editor don't come to me directly. There are people who, collate these.
Lucky people. What a great job.
But I do try to read them every day on the page before they go to print. But problematic ones will come to me. And a lot of, the ones that are outright racist, that's easy, right? No, we're not going to publish that. But it's that constant balance between allowing people to have a say and not censoring people, but also not acting as a forum for even slightly racist speech, slightly hateful. And so that is a constant balancing act about where do you draw the line. And obviously we're not going to print letters that are racist, but there are some grey areas sometimes. So I'm increasingly now, not on racism, just like antiquated views, I guess I would say. But so increasingly I want to allow all of that people to have their say if they know that they are their ardently held beliefs, but that's something I might get wrong and hopefully fix the next day.
I think, editing sounds a lot like curating in some ways, or programming where you are making conscious, and you said it yourself, I'm biased, we're all biased, and we're all making decisions around which voices we amplify and which voices we turn down a little bit because they've been heard too much or because they're blocking out other voices that maybe we need to hear more. And it's kind of like having one of those kind of control desks in front of you with every decision that you're making with journalists. Does it must weigh on you?
It does. It weighs on me a lot. Constantly trying to get that balance and do the right thing. And I've made mistakes, and that really weighs on me. It doesn't get any easier when you make the wrong call, but it's a teachable moment, right? Like I can only use that and try to do better next time. But yeah, luckily we get to do it every single day, so there's always another opportunity.
You mentioned public interest just before, and you mentioned the Public Interest Journalism Fund when you were speaking. I wonder if you could just talk a bit more about that, because I think it's actually having potentially quite a transformative effect on the New Zealand media, and a lot of the coverage about it is coming from a critical point of view. I heard Sean Plunkett talking to Duncan Grieve the other day about his new platform, The Platform, saying they would never take money like that and be beholden to the government. Like that's the joining up that's being done around this. But can you just our audience might not be as familiar with it. Talk about a bit about it and the goals and the changes that you think it might achieve.
Yeah, you won't be surprised to hear that I ardently disagree with Sean Plunkett on this. But in the way, so this is this pot of money that the government has allocated. It's administered through New Zealand On Air, through the Public Interest Journalism Fund, and there have been several rounds. So some of the rounds were for the creation of specific roles, and others were more project-based, but very broad-brush thematic, like court reporting and things, like not, I want to write this, do this project or this story. So the level of oversight is really minimal. But the main way that we at Stuff have applied for these funds and are using them is to grow our workforce. And so for the first time last year, we had the number of journalists working at Stuff went up, not down, first time in years. But in particular, our Potiaki, our diversity team, which is mainly based in Auckland, I think we have 10 or 11 or 12 new reporters.
Amazing.
Yeah, it's huge. And that we have specifically gone out to increase the diversity in our newsroom. So not only are we growing, but we have much more diversity of our reporters in many different ways. And so that will really be reflected in our coverage, I think, now that we have many more Māori reporters, Pacifica reporters, ethnic Chinese reporters, all able to bring their lived experience to their journalism. So I hope that you will start seeing the fruits of that. But also, so that's happening. There's very vibrant competition for journalists now, which is wonderful to see after so many years of decline.
That beautiful feeling of growing new people and then releasing them onto their next opportunity.
Yes, but also it's kind of encouraged us to think outside the box in some ways. And so, whenever I advertise jobs, I'm often dismayed at the lack of diversity in the candidates I get, and I think, how do I do this? And so one thing I've done recently is I have a year-long maternity cover, and instead of just hiring a journalist to fill that, I created it as an internship program for a aspiring Māori journalists. So now we have this incredible 20-year-old woman from Ngāti Toa who has come and joined us for a year, and she gets to see if she likes journalism, and we get to train her, and hopefully if we can grow that kind of pipeline one by one, that then there will be more representative journalism in our mahi.
You mentioned a newish role of a explainer journalist. Are there other newish approaches coming through at the moment?
Yeah, there are. I mean, we have a lot more, whether it's video journalism or like different multimedia approaches. The explainer side of things is something that has been really, really popular, whether it's breaking down. I think it's a very accessible form of journalism because it's often just done in Q&A style. So with complicated things like the science around coronavirus and vaccines and that kind of stuff, it's really helpful. But even, people kind of joke with inside stuff like, oh, there goes Anna talking about China again, because I do talk about China a lot. But in October last year, when there were lots of back and forth between China and Taiwan, I asked one of the journalist to write an explainer why New Zealand should care about Taiwan. It did super well. It was the second most clicked story on Stuff that day, behind the COVID live blog, which is always number one. But I think that really speaks to an appetite in New Zealand to have these basic stories broken down and explained, these complicated stories broken down and explained. And in fact, when Jeff Bezos bought the Washington Post in 2013, he cited two stories that he really loved and what made him want to buy the company. And one of them was 9 things you wanted to know about Syria but were too afraid to ask. And that was one of the really kind of formative pieces of journalism that sparked this whole explainer craze. And so I think that probably has a lot of overlap with libraries and museums as well, right? Like the breaking down these things and telling people the basics.
I think a sense that's growing in our community at the moment as we kind of remain under this the tsunami of COVID and also so looking after our workforce, looking after our audiences, constantly planning, replanning, juggling all of our programming and absorbing all the information that's coming at us and thinking a lot about social cohesion and where identity and recognition of yourself as a person sits in misinformation and disinformation. I think we've got a slow growing concern that we're losing sight of some of the other really important things that we need to be talking to the public about, and that climate change and climate urgency is probably one of those. Is there room in the media at the moment for other conversations?
Yes, there is.
And demand from audiences?
Yeah, and that's another exciting development. I think that we now have this unit, a climate change unit called the Forever Project, that's doing a lot, and they're really expert. They can tell you anything about COP26, and they're really expert journalists. There is definitely appetite for that. I think at the moment it's not as great as the appetite for coverage about COVID and these kind of, because that is a crisis that is upon us right now. I mean, climate change is a much bigger crisis, right? An existential, generational crisis that will be with us for decades unless we do something about it. Well, still, even if we do something about it, it'll still be with us. So I guess it's incumbent on us to frame these stories in this way and explain to readers and viewers, why this matters, why this is a big deal, and write in an engaging way about these issues to give them the coverage that they deserve. Yeah.
Selfishly, while I've got you sitting here, just take advantage of all of your experience. One of the things in the first lockdown, some people might remember, Bauer Media sold out of New Zealand. Titles were shutting down everywhere. Yeah. It was quite. I mean, I love the media. I'm a media junkie. I love listening to the media talk about itself. I'm in that little overlap of the Venn diagram. And I really felt the dismay and fear in the industry, and there's been a bounce back. But I was in one of those myriad kind of first lockdown calls with ministers talking about the effects. And one of the things that I talked about there was how dependent cultural institutions actually are on media organisations to amplify our reach. We all have these tiny, skinny little marketing budgets. So we're really actually reliant on it and grateful for the media's work in amplifying our content and our stories and our perspectives. How do we do a really good job of building relationships with our local media outlets or national media outlets and being good and interesting to work with?
That's a great question. Just to go back to the Bauer thing, that was a really, really scary time, right? And that is one very positive thing, the fact that all of those magazines still exist today. In fact, more magazines exist today, that they were all able to be revived and have a new lease on life. So I'm a particular fan of North and South in its new form. So yeah, that's great that they exist. I mean, I think a lot of this is about relationships and that journalists are always under a lot of pressure, always have too many things to do, and just sending a press release to somebody will go into an inbox with 50 other press releases that day. But I think if we look at kind of our arts reporting that we're doing in my team, you know, you will know my arts reporter, and many people around town will know him because he's out and about and talking to people and is really invested in that. So I think the more you can do to have conversations with reporters, to drag them away from that daily grind and just explain your mission and what you're trying to do and why it's exciting. You know, the constant thing I'm asking reporters to write into their stories is why this matters, why you should care about this, how this affects your life. So I think the more you can do to explain that or to make it relevant to people's lives is the better, the more likely you're going to get some traction like that with the public and with the journalists. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Anna, for your openness and your generosity today. I think I'll wind up and throw back to Jim in a minute, but is there anything I should have asked you? Is there anything that you wanted to say?
I said a lot.
To this audience that you haven't had a chance to?
No, I think we covered it. I mean, yeah, I talked about the things I wanted to, and your questions were great, so I think that's good.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Just thank you so much, Anna. I really, I genuinely mean it. You've become such an engaged and present person in the Wellington scene, and your influence is being felt in the conversations that happen in this city and happen nationally as well. And I really admire. Takes an enormous strength of purpose to hold that, but you do it in a friendly and engaging and sometimes really excitingly pointed way as well. The balance that you show is quite incredible, and we're really lucky. We're lucky to have you here today, but we're just lucky to have you in general.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here, and I do always err on the side of talking about like transparency and trying to talk about what we do. Maybe I offer too much sometimes. I can't tell if there were any gasps in the audience today, but thank you for giving me this opportunity. I enjoyed it.
Cool. Thanks so much, Anna, and back to Jim.